Hi, I'm Konrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, a magazine for your ears featuring in-depth conversations with fascinating people from sport and politics, science and culture, business and beyond. Every week you can download new episodes in which top journalists from across our newsrooms talk to compelling people about the definitive stories of the day. This week is the final issue of the magazine for the year, featuring a series of reflective pieces from Good Weekend staff writers and our favourite contributors, all of whom were invited to write about something funny, poignant or remarkable from their lives in 2024. Coming into summer, I wrote about how and when and why I recognised I was a water baby, while the person next to me, my fellow Good Weekend senior writer Amanda Hooton, wrote about processing the end of her daughter's years in primary school. It's become an annual tradition at Good Weekend Talks for staff writers to get behind the microphone at this time of year for a chat about the specialist craft of magazine writing. And with that in mind, the final episode of Season 5 of Good Weekend Talks will feature Amanda and myself answering questions from our fearless editor, Katrina Strickland. So welcome Amanda and Katrina. Take it away, boss.
Thank you, Konrad, and welcome, Konrad and Amanda.
Hello.
It's rare that we're all in the same room, isn't it, Konrad? Listeners might not even know Konrad's based in Melbourne and Amanda and I are based in Sydney.
That's right.
We were having a look at the top rating stories for the year, and one of the highest rating, Amanda, was your piece on why suddenly everyone got ADHD. I thought it was an interesting point to start with because that story didn't start as a long cover story, and people often ask, how do stories develop? So tell us how, when the idea came to you and then how it went. I think it started as a 2-page first-person reflections piece, and then it kind of evolved into what it ended up as a cover story. Tell us about the process.
Yeah, that's right, actually. I mean, it's always tricky, isn't it? I mean, it feels as if it was the origins of everything are lost in the mists of time, slightly. I think we thought originally that the piece was a 2-pager because there'd already been quite a lot of stuff in the news. You know, it was one of those kind of zeitgeist issues. Everybody was talking about ADHD. Lots of people were either, receiving diagnoses themselves or knew of people of all ages that were getting diagnosed with the condition. And I think, so there's always a sort of reluctance, I think, to kind of go big on a story like that because you think, well, there's so much out there. What can we add to it? Or certainly I feel that. But I think once I started looking into it, I realised that actually that all of those news stories and all of that really good reporting that had been done was felt like a kind of bedrock of information that was then kind of out there in the sort of public sphere. And that had led to a whole lot of new sort of questions and new sort of ideas that people were kind of mulling over and that were kind of swirling around, it felt like. And certainly that I had, that hadn't been addressed or hadn't been answered. And it had also given rise to a lot of conflict. So there was a lot of public debate happening. There was a lot of people with very strong opinions on kind of every side of the question. And, the more I looked into it, the more there seemed to be to say that was actually kind of new, or at least offer the opportunity for new analysis of the whole topic.
And answering that question, which we did put on the cover, which a lot of people had been asking themselves, like why is there suddenly such a high rate?
Yes.
And it's interesting what you say because sometimes we get that judgment right and sometimes wrong in terms of if there's a lot around about a subject, sometimes we can do the definitive piece that brings it all together and it will be hugely popular. And other times you can be slightly behind the wave and everyone does feel like they've already read it. So
it's
a hard judgment call, isn't it, as to where it sits there. One of the other difficulties with that story, of course, is the controversy and the fact that there's, we all know there's, statistics can be used in any way you want to paint whatever picture you want. How did you go about finding your way through all the facts and research and being able to write about it in a way that kept the reader interested and didn't get bogged down in all the facts, but also didn't get you cancelled? Because I remember we had quite a few conversations about that at the time. It's really hard to try and be neutral but also saying something and using the facts to drive the story forward and have something to say.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I guess, that's the $64 million question, isn't it? How do you kind of get the reader through a big story like that, which is very fact sort of based? I mean, I was very fortunate to find a really good case study who was willing to go on the record, a young woman called Sophie Knight, who starts the story. She reappears through the story. And so Sophie was willing to go on the record. I also spoke to the mother of a teenager with ADHD, and although she wasn't named, she was willing to sort of tell her story, her son's story and her perspective on it truthfully. And so, people's own stories always really help those fact-heavy stories for readers to sort of have a sense of what's happening to a real person. And then I think, it comes back to that thing of remembering what the questions that you have about the topic and what those questions are, and trying to actively engage with those questions. And, sometimes it is literally, you have to write the questions in the story. What is going on? Why is everybody suddenly being diagnosed with ADHD? And then you have to kind of use the facts to answer those questions. And I guess the other thing for readers, they want to hear their questions or see their questions answered. And they also want to recognise their own experience in the story. So, I know when I read a feature, I love it when I have that little hit of recognition where I think, oh, yeah, that's exactly what I think about that topic, or that's what happened to me, or that's what I heard about too, so what's going on there? So I think, trying to be sensitive to what readers are wanting and what readers are feeling, if you can get any of that into a story, if people read that, then they are immediately kind of captured because they're like, yes, that's my experience.
I can see myself in that.
Yeah.
We did put a call out to our readers and listeners on our social media, asking them, did they have any questions for writers? And one of them is pertinent to this story. One of the readers said, how do you balance the kind of duty of care to subjects with your need to tell the truth? And I think in this story that was really front of mind, because you had a mother with a son with ADHD, you had a young woman with ADHD, and yet there was also some criticism of ADHD diagnoses and the levels. How do you balance that? Because I think that is an interesting question that we all grapple with in almost every story.
Yeah. I think actually trying to sort of really do your job, the sort of fundamental job as a journalist, goes quite a long way towards resolving that question. So, that means being really clear with the subject about what the story is and truthful, and saying, look, I am going to talk to people who are critical of the condition, and I'm going to try and put both sides of this story, or in this case, multiple sides of a story. So, yeah, being clear with the subject, always offering the subject the right of reply, trying to, if you have something that is, as in this case, very critical of ADHD, then also balancing that with the sort of opposing view of other people. It was a really great exercise for me, actually, this story, because, it was such a factual story. It was an unusually clear opportunity to just try to get back to those real journalistic roots of being as objective as possible, trying really hard not to let my own prejudices or my own sort of opinions kind of direct the story.
Follow the facts.
Yeah, just to follow the facts, just to tell the story, to tell all the sides of the story, and let the reader, especially in this debate. And actually it was a huge thrill for me. A couple of people wrote and said, I couldn't tell where you stood on this story, and that was refreshing.
That's job well done.
Yeah, I felt like that was a great compliment in that kind of context, because for just about everybody, there are very strong feelings attached to it. So it was great to have the chance to just be like, put all of that aside and just say the thing. Yeah, just tell the story.
You really followed your curiosity with the story too. Like it wasn't, here's a slab of facts, here's a slab of counter facts, here's the weighty expert opinion, and then another one. It was, interesting people with interesting views, with interesting backgrounds, and it made the piece eminently readable, even though it was a very long,
It was a
kind
very
of
long piece.
complicated story.
Oh, well, thank you.
But it was like
That's
you were
great to
following what
hear.
interested you, and I always think that's a good guide.
Yeah.
That's what it will probably interest the reader too.
I think that's exactly right. I think, yes, yeah, there's nothing new under the sun. You know, we're all people kind of, grappling with these things in quite similar ways when you get down to it, I think. Yeah.
And Konrad, one of your top raters for the year, interestingly, also wasn't initially conceived as a cover story, which was the troubles that craft brewers were in both here and internationally. Again, one of the questions from readers was, how do you get your ideas? So let's go to how that idea came about, and again, how it evolved from really, I think your original conception was a kind of short second or third feature, and then it really did turn out to be not only a cover story but a massively popular cover story, which took you by surprise, I remember.
Yeah, it was shocking. Well, first of all,
Not shocking, good shocking.
Where you get your story ideas is an awful question. So thank you for asking it. I really hate that one.
Why do you hate that one?
Because you get asked it all the time. You get asked it at as many barbecues as you get people coming up to you saying, I've got a really good story idea for you.
That is true.
But also,
the worst one is, can I write a story for you? I'm not a journalist, but.
But also I feel like that question in this particular instance outs me as a very big beer nerd, because that's where it began. I, like a lot of people throughout the pandemic, was confined to my couch on a Friday night and had that little bit of expendable income because you're not going out. And I'd drift down to the local cellars and buy these weird, crazy, oddly expensive cans of very strange beer. And then I noticed how many fridges were being taken up in that space, and how this craft beer explosion seemed to be just unrelenting and happening apace. But then a couple of years down the track, as I got more and more interested in it and more besotted with various sour beers and wheat beers and stouts and you name it, I then began to notice sort of the opposite. You'd get these little reports of breweries closing and you'd think, well, hang on, they won a bunch of awards last year. Like, that's one of my favourite breweries, and one of the ones that beer nerds on forums online are really crazy about. And then it would happen again and again. And then little stories began popping up in the newspaper, and often that's really a good source of stories for us as long-form writers, is a daily rounds reporter or a beat reporter has found something and they follow it with little pieces throughout, but maybe they don't have that luxury of time that we have, or that luxury of real estate, like 5,000 words to expend on a story. And so,
that can be tricky, right? Because they often do want to do it themselves, and you're kind of resting it off them as the big piece.
You do feel like the vulture, particularly because you often really need to lean on that person for assistance. Like, I'd really love to speak to this person that you quoted in a story from a few months ago. Can you put me in touch? And what else should I know? And for the most part, they're incredibly gracious about that, and they just want the story to be done well. But
and they don't have the time either, because they're on the beat every day. But that's right. Always an interesting kind of relationship, isn't it, on a story like that?
It's a tricky one.
And why do you think that story resonated so much?
Yeah, I mean, beer is still exceptionally popular. So I think whenever you're crafting a story for the magazine, you want to think about the swath of readers that are going to just be interested in that topic. And we forget, like, it's a sort of a dominant beverage. And so there's a lot of interest there. But then maybe it just comes down to some of the notions of unfairness that govern that industry and some of the mysteries around it. And it plays out in so many other spheres, like a lot of the distilleries are going under as well, even though they have kind of gold medal scotches and gins and whatnot. And at its heart, there's this sort of very unlevel, unfair kind of business playing field when it comes to taxation and a bunch of other issues.
That's so true. So it plays into our sense of David and Goliath, kind of like a story about the little guy who's getting screwed over by the system.
It's about beer and it's about a fair go.
Yeah. I think that's part of it. And also I wonder if it's that thing of like so many people now dream of, the entrepreneurial dream is probably bigger than it was decades ago. With 20-somethings wanting to start their own brewery or start their own gin or start their own makeup company or something. And so it was also a depressing lesson that sometimes that sounds so cool and, column from accounts, and yet it's the harsh reality is you can lose your money, or you can just work yourself to the bone, or you can just do really well and then get, screwed over by the system.
Most of the stories were just stories of heartbreak. And incredibly devoted and very smart and rational and careful, fastidious sort of people getting into this industry, but then just ultimately getting burned by the system and by circumstance.
And how do you get those people to participate? Because it's a little bit like Amanda's ADHD when, people don't tend to want to talk about their failures. They have to be quite evolved often, don't they, to really be open to being on the cover of a magazine talking about what didn't work. How did you bring those brewers who participated and got photographed to the table?
I think it helped with a lot of them that I was able to start from a position of fandom. Like, I like these beers. They're disappearing for whatever reason. Can you explain that to me? I'm going to look at all of the potential own goals and failures within the industry. So exactly what Amanda said, you need to be open and upfront about where you're going to go, and that it's not just going to be their side of the story. And once they understand that, where you're coming from and what the process is going to look like, I think people just feel more comfortable because you've removed the entire mystery from the equation. Because there is a lot of mystery for people, right? Like, how many people actually get written about in a magazine? We do it every day, but they have no idea what it looks like.
And it does help, I think, with magazine piece that there's the length to tell the story from all sides, which you're both kind of saying, and to have the texture and the nuance that so it's by nature of the length, it's not a gotcha. It's not. It's rarely a kind of a thing where they're going to get shocked at how they've been portrayed, because the length means you can have all sides and all the shades of grey.
Well, I think when you began as editor, you started saying as and you could see it in pitches that we would make to either profile subjects or people about topics like, a good weekend, we want to write the definitive story. And I kind of include that shorthand in most of my pitches as well, because I think it resonates with people that you're gonna completely circle this thing.
And take care.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other big thing obviously this year was the Olympics, and you were both heavily involved. Konrad, I
think Konrad's slightly
Konrad
more
got the trip to Paris.
Than me.
Yeah, that's right. Konrad, you went as part of the Sydney Morning Herald and Age contingent.
I did.
You've written a lot about sports and you've won multiple sports journalist awards. Tell us why you wanted to go and what surprised you the most about that experience.
Well, I think I've been writing long form for quite a while, but obviously, like any journalist, I started in daily newspaper reporting, and I guess I wanted a taste of the immediacy again of short form and the adrenaline of covering something live and not having all that time to craft something lyrical and just push yourself, really, get out of your comfort zone. And I was really curious about whether my short form skills would have atrophied over time, if that muscle had just wasted away after all these years. But it's amazing how the pressure of the deadline and that adrenaline just kicks in and carries you forward, and you just, I don't know, I found that you sort of had this muscle memory because you're going from place to place. One day you're covering archery, which you know nothing about, like 3 hours before you go out there to watch people loosing arrows. And then the next you're covering equestrian or kayaking, and you have to become this quick study. And where is that? And oh my God, I need to leave 3 hours in advance and it starts at 9. So I guess I'm up at 4 tomorrow. And these long, frantic days with walking. Nobody tells you about the walking. Like you walk 10, 15 kilometres a day in the middle of summer covering these things, trying to find the right stadium door. And
are you filing from there? You're taking your computer and just logging on there and
taking a computer along, logging on. But first you've got to sort of acquaint yourself with every new facility that you're at, unless you're one of those people that sort of, I cover athletics and I'm at the track every day or I'm at the pool every night, the way a Michael Gleason or a Tom Decent might be. No, I was sort of going out to one new stadium after another, and it's like, all right, find out where the mixed zone is, which is where the athletes come off and do interviews immediately after a game. Find out where the media centre is, which is where you can sit and file. Find out where the media tribune is, which is where you have your seat so you can take notes and watch as the game's going on. Now figure out how long it'll take to get from one to the other and where you need to be to make sure you don't miss.
It's sounding stressful, Konrad.
I'm stressing myself out again all over.
What was the most stressful? Can you give us an anecdote that shows either the most stressful or the most surprising or the most joyous, or all three?
Yeah. Look, it probably would be. I was lucky enough to cover both of the Fox sisters when they won gold medals. And those runs, those gold medal runs, they are super quick. And you're sitting in baking sun. It's 39 degrees and humid, and you're watching them go down and just scribbling down notes, again, about a sport that you know nothing about prior to that day, trying to get a handle on who they're competing against, when they edge in front, where they make a mistake. And then you've got to sprint down to that mixed zone and kind of elbow people aside or make sure that you get there in front of centre to get one question off at least. Sometimes that won't happen and you have to kind of put your phone on a tray that somebody carries around. So there'll be this person whose job it is to carry 15 iPhones on a tray and place them in front of the face of the athlete that's being interviewed.
So you set it on record.
You set it on record.
You just get your phone back off the tray and see what you've got.
That's right. And then, of course, you've got to go back and immediately crank something out. And I don't know, you're the only person there because, they don't have the resources to send a couple of staff to most
You're the
of
only
these
Australian
events.
Or
the
only
only
one
person from the
your
Age and
organisation,
the SMH. Yeah. And so you've got to get it right, and you have to, compose this piece that gives people the news, but also takes them there, gives them something that they don't get from watching it on TV or seeing a snippet on socials. And look, probably that's where the magazine writing comes in handy, because those pieces could be 1,000 or 1,500 words long. There was some space to play and bring colour and movement and joy into it when, Naomi Fox wins the gold that she hadn't been able to win so far and moves out of her sister's shadow on a hot day. Like,
you were there.
Yeah, bit of an honour to do it, really.
And Amanda, you've done 2 Olympians.
Yes.
One before the Games began, Ariarne Titmus, the swimmer, and then one after was Nina Kennedy, the pole vaulter. How was it different? I guess one was before and one was after. Was there a big kind of difference in their kind of sensibility, given one was hoping to win and actually did end up winning, and the other one had already come out the other side having won?
I think it's a good question. I haven't even thought about it. I guess, of course, Ariarne was very careful because, she had it kind of all to do. It was in front of her, and she was clearly sort of confident and clearly knew that she, was a real favourite for the for the 400, and I suspect she really felt like she was in with a chance in the 200 as well.
Freestyle.
In the freestyles, that's right. But it was different. She was very, very self-contained and hopeful, whereas Nina, who I interviewed after her gold medal performance in pole vault, she was just so thrilled and so relieved, and so the whole experience was completely different because
Much more joyous.
Yeah, it was. It was just all upside. It was all the memory of it was so thrilling to her. I think it still felt like a miracle on some level that it had actually come off. She had put everything in place, and she was absolutely determined and completely. I mean, I think that's the fascinating thing about these people, however different they are and whatever point you see them in. People who take on a sort of a dream like that and just sort of put themselves on the line and put years of their life on the line in something like a sporting event, they all have the ability to sort of somehow control their own mental world, in a way that makes that feasible. I mean, it's
They're
just
all
an
quite
extraordinary
people, aren't
that
they?
part of them is extraordinary. I mean, often when the difficulty is getting them to talk about that, because they either aren't doing they don't do it consciously, or they're just not used to articulating it. And so they come across often just as very, normal people with, normal sort of ways of interacting with the world. But because you see, I mean, Ariane Titmus, the thing of her standing up on that block, in a aquatic centre with, Katie Ledecky beside her and a billion people watching on TV, and knowing that the next 4 minutes or less are going to define the last decade of her life. And the fact that she can do that, she can do that and not just kind of collapse under the strain. I can't even watch that moment, I find it just overwhelming. It makes my legs feel weak even thinking about it. So that and Nina has that same ability, like that those people have that thing inside where they can come right to that point of absolute tension and they can perform, under those circumstances.
But they're not always introspective about it.
No,
or,
that's right.
Articulate about it.
That's
and
right.
That's why sports people, they can sometimes be really boring,
Yeah.
the subjects, unless you can find that.
Yeah, unless you can find a way to get them to talk about it. That's right. I mean, Nina was really exceptional because she has done a lot of very conscious work. So she's worked with sports psychologists, she's worked with counsellors, she's done a lot of reading and investigation of her own sort of mental state, I think. And so she had very conscious sort of patterns and processes that she went through. And, I always think it's wonderful because, when you watch her before she starts a vault, you can see that she's speaking, you can see her lips moving. And what she's actually telling herself is a sort of a little mental rundown of what she's about to do. So she's just talking herself through her process as a way of kind of containing the tension. And what she basically says to herself is, yes, brain, thank you for the information that I'm standing here at the Paris Olympics, with the eyes of the world on me. I recognise it. I know that's happening, but all I have to do here is my job, which is to, take 10 steps, start lowering my pole, take another 6 steps, put the pole in the box. I mean, not in those words exactly, but she just tells herself what she has to do in a very sort of calm, straightforward way. And I find it remarkable. I just find that whole sort of moment extraordinary.
And it's funny, isn't it? Because often, in journalism, we're the trained observers and we're outside and we're not here to cheerlead. We're here to report. And yet I remember it's slightly different with sports people because after you'd written about Ariane, you and I were both like, we're getting up at 1 a.m. to watch and she better win, because we are team Ariane
we
now.
Absolutely
it's funny
are.
how that kind of, that journalistic distance
You've been on a lot of teams this year, then, haven't you? You've been riding Jamie Carter victory.
Exactly. It's quite unusual, isn't it?
It's one of the lovely things
other than sport.
About
You're not
sport.
really.
That's right. That it is so. It's possible. I had my very first editor used to love sports stories, and he said, the great thing, loved writing sports stories, and he used to say the great thing about sport is you can make it mythic. You can engage with sport in a way that it's very hard to with other subjects, and I think it's because on some it means everything and nothing. People care so much about it, so that people will read it, but the fate of nations doesn't turn on. Whether Nina wins the pole vault. So it's yes, you can kind of let go of that journalistic distance a little bit and be on team.
Yeah. Speaking of very first editors, one of the other questions that readers asked was how did you get your start and what drew you to magazine writing? Can you each just give me, very potted because we don't have a lot of time left, Konrad, can you give us your path into magazine writing, or first of all into journalism and then into magazine?
Journalism was a bit of a fluke. I was working in PR, and I guess the thing I liked most when I was doing that was the writing, whether it was press releases or stories for internal, external publications, and so found my way into daily journalism that way. Getting into magazine writing came about kind of organically insofar as that's what I liked to read. When I was working in dailies for a decade, I would say I read magazines far more than I read newspapers. I had subscriptions to maybe a dozen.
And what was that about? Was that about the writing or the shades of grey in magazines, in the stories? What was it?
I mean, it's both of those things, but it probably started with the writing. I loved the way that magazines could afford the writer this chance to create a big, bold kind of creative launch for their story. These sort of anecdotal leads and conceptual leads where they're inside somebody's head, just stuff that is unlike anything that you read in the daily newspaper. And that they could be so varied, so you could really tap into your creative side. And I think what began to happen was I would write my daily newspaper stories and features in that mould as well, and would often have to be reined back in by editors who
wanted.
Give us the facts,
Konrad. Can we have that inverted pyramid, please? But it was very hard for them to beat it out of me, and so the first chance I got to write for a magazine, I did.
And what about you, Amanda?
Yes, well, it was just a question of my inability to do anything else, I think.
That's always quite useful, isn't it?
It is. It makes the choices very simple. Yeah. I didn't do any sort of training in journalism. I did a degree in medieval history and English, so I was qualified to do absolutely nothing in the real world.
A highly vocational course.
Yes, exactly.
Philosophy, anthropology here.
There you go.
And
there
psych.
You go. Absolutely, it's a miracle that we've got anything sort of meaningful to do with our day. But yeah, so I loved reading feature writing. I was completely not a newspaper reader or a news story sort of, the furthest thing imaginable from a news hound. But I got some work experience at a magazine. I was in the UK where I went to university, and I went to a newspaper, and the only place on the newspaper that would give me work experience was a magazine, because they didn't have the daily deadlines and they didn't have the sort of skill requirement in a funny kind of a way. I didn't need legal skills, legal training or shorthand or any of those sorts of things that daily journalists sort of need to have, or expertise on a particular round. So the magazine said, oh yeah, can come and sit on the radiator in the magazine offices for a fortnight. And, I went down there, wrote a single story in that fortnight, and then the editor, who was a great person, said, look, you can stay for another 2 weeks, and if you get anything else published, we'll pay you as a freelancer. So I stayed 2 years on that basis, and learnt very swiftly how to get a story into the paper, because that was the only point at which I was getting anything, I was earning any money. So that's how that started.
Okay, so now a few quick fire questions for each of you. So just who do you look at, Konrad, as your favourite writers, can be here or overseas, in journalism, in magazine writing?
Probably the pinnacle for me would be someone like David Gran. Writes a lot for The New Yorker and has produced that many pieces that go on to become later books and then movies. His stuff is just without peer.
Amanda?
I cannot give one person, that's just impossible. But someone I have absolutely loved reading this year is Tim Hayward, who writes, of all things, the restaurant reviews in the Financial Times in London. And I just think that is such a difficult form to write. He's been doing it for 10 years. And actually I just recently discovered he's stepping back from reviewing to write about food more generally, I think. So I really hope, we don't sort of lose him in that sense. But, I mean, I just think the sort of way he works in a very constrained form, it's just so funny and so erudite, and so everything is so beautifully sort of constructed, and he still tells you how whether the restaurant is worth it or not. I'm just sort of filled with admiration. I love reading his stuff.
Another question from our social media poll is, at what point in the story do you know this is what it's about? Do you know that at the beginning, or do you work it out through the research, or is it halfway through the writing? Konrad?
I find that I know it about halfway through the research. There's something about that. I'm sure I could pick up something later that would determine it, but for whatever reason, when you're approaching the subject really fresh, in those first 4 or 5 interviews with people or scenes that you've gone out and seen, I can pretty much picture the beginning of the story, and that kind of gives me the nut graph and the track of where it's going to go.
Amanda?
I often only discover the story when I am halfway through the writing, which is, of course, absolutely appalling, because that is at the point at which I need to go.
The end.
I then need to go back to the person and start all over again, and with a whole lot of new questions. But yeah, I find kind of scrabbling my way through it is a very long process, and often takes much, much longer than I would wish.
Final question. Do either of you have particular goals from a writing perspective for 2025? Konrad?
I don't want to say them, because I say them every year for the last 2-3 years and still haven't found the time or the right subject to do them. But I've always wanted to write one of those really big long form stories about a kind of pivotal court case that everybody is thinking about. Like I'd love to park myself in the Supreme Court following something that everyone's interested in, and then write the massive kind of definitive feature that circles it. That would be a goal. And I'd love to profile a Polly. I've never really profiled a Polly in a national magazine, so if I could just find the right person from Canberra, that would be great too.
Those court case ones, it's interesting to wonder if you can still do that in this time of so many people writing so many things and online. Will it hold for the length of time you need for a magazine piece? Do you think it's harder to say yes?
Well, I would have said that, but the winner of the Walkley for feature writing this year was probably the best thing I've read in Australia all year, and that was Sarah Krasnosin's look at the Malka Leifer trial in Melbourne. And I almost feel like that's a story that only she could have written, like a legal background, a background in that cultural community. But she followed it so well and cracked it open completely, and it was emotive and tough and lyrical, and I mean, it was also probably like 10,000 words or something. I mean, it was a beast.
Yeah.
But
which again shows that thing that we say, if you can do the definitive piece, it doesn't matter if everyone's written
That's right.
miles and miles of copy on it. Amanda, any particular goals for next year?
I am going with the Olympic idea of faster, higher, stronger. I just want to get faster. I feel like it's been so hard to just keep keep things moving, with this year. I think that's often the problem with long form stuff, is that it's because it seems to stretch out forever. You never know how close you are to the end, and so you're not very good at organising your next story so that you don't have a break in between.
Because
and then
you're so fully immersed.
Yeah, and then you try and sort of shoehorn in little stories in between that then end up becoming much bigger than you expected. And yeah, I'd like to just get more. I feel like if I could be more efficient, I would get to the end of more days feeling like I'd had a satisfying day, of achievement.
It is interesting though, isn't it, that almost every writer that I work with, at the end of one of those really big cover stories, you are exhausted and you can't go straight on to another one. You have to do a tour of us or a spotlight or a smaller, almost like a brain cleanser.
I need to do them in the middle. Yeah. Sometimes, honestly, like I'll do all of the reporting for a big piece and it's like I'm really not ready to confront the amount of stuff I've gathered and form it into a story. Yeah. Can I do a two of us or some little one-pager that doesn't require that sort of commitment?
But that's something I envy daily journalists so much, is that sense of achievement that you get at the end of every story. It's exhausting, but you also feel like you exist, It's that terrible thing where you only feel like you really are out there in the world when you're in the paper. And so when that only happens once a month, you spend a long time in this kind of limbo world. And I love that feeling of actually even just getting to the end of the day knowing I've written 500 words that will make it into the story, So I'd like that feeling more often.
Right. Okay, well, we'll see what we can do about that. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Konrad, and happy holidays.
Thank you. You
You
too.
too. Thank you. That was Good Weekend editor Katrina Strickland interviewing staff writers Amanda Hooton and Konrad Marshall on the latest Good Weekend Talks. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, rate and comment wherever you get your podcasts, and keep tuning in for more compelling conversations. Like most of you, we're taking a short break over the end of the year, so in the coming weeks we'll be running a few of our most popular episodes from 2024. But rest assured, we'll be back with new episodes in January as we launch Season 6 of Good Weekend Talks. Good Weekend Talks is brought to you by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, proud newsrooms powered by subscriptions. To support independent journalism, search Subscribe Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. This episode of Good Weekend Talks is produced by Chi Wong. Editing from Konrad Marshall, Tom McKendrick is head of audio, and Katrina Strickland is the editor of Good Weekend.